The Make It Make Sense with Tomee Sojourner-Campbell podcast explores real-world work and social issues, the power of storytelling, and offers listeners practical insights and actionable solutions, with guests from across the globe sharing their knowledge and their creative practices. My guest today is Erin Haskett, president of Lark Productions. Erin has over 25 years experience developing and producing incredible stories and exceptional content. She right now serves as the executive producer of the Canadian adaptation of Law and Order Toronto, Criminal Intent for Rogers and Universal Television. She's so much more than what I've just read, and I will be posting her bio in the link below. And one of the reasons I wanted to have Erin on today to have a conversation about the power of telling really diverse stories in this time and the changes that are happening in our society is that I've found that Erin is a very intentional leader. And that's important. We need leaders who are going to lead by example. And so one of the first questions I thought would be lovely to start with is asking you about what is the most inspiring story you've ever heard or told?
Well, that's a big question. First of all, thanks for having me in this conversation. I feel, I'm constantly learning and I'm constantly being exposed to new stories. And I think that's part of why I love my job and the kind of collaboration that I get to be a part of. When we say most inspiring stories, I think it's sort of like what are the kind of stories that you realize have impact, and how does that impact then translate into action? And I would say, like, if we're talking about stories, we do a series called Alliegence for CBC. Season 3 is currently airing, and in season 1 of Alliegence, there's an episode that was written by a writer named Penny Gummerson, who's an Indigenous writer, who, spoke a lot about healing circles in the Indigenous community. And, I know Anar Ali, that was important to her when she first started conceiving the concept of Alliegence, is learning about restorative justice and using all cultures and experience of looking at justice in different cultures. And I know, learning from Penny, the work that she did, even in some of the prisons with women, that she had learned their stories, and that idea of sort of having that conversation around acknowledging where people have come from and what does that mean in terms of how do we understand justice. And as somebody who produces shows, particularly in the genre of crime procedural, I've had to think a lot about, our intention in the stories that we're telling and how we're telling them, and how could the stories that we learn inspire others to look at our justice system differently.
Okay, and I think that, in terms of the storytelling around the insights of folks who may not be heard from very often, especially within the sort of the idea of this, the criminal, talking about crimes and the communities that tend to be more criminalized or pathologized in society, I think is a good way to break open some of the myths and stereotypes that exist in society in general, and offering a different way of telling a story than perhaps having a conversation or a training session might do. And I certainly know that, as you talk about transformative justice, restorative justice, what's happening in our society today, and I think certainly from the perspective of historically marginalized communities, where and how are those stories be told? Who's telling those stories, right? The idea of authenticity and voice and connection, and looking at, one of the areas that I look at in my sort of work is around an issue called consumer racial profiling, and the idea of what happens when through people's movements and retail spaces, how their stories get lost when they're either falsely accused of shoplifting or what have you, and how when we hear it in the news or when we talk about it in our communities, how it's such an important place that we are disrupting common narratives and stereotypes that exist within broader societies, but also within our own communities, right? And so that one of the things I really appreciate what you're saying is, how do we store a sense of justice when justice is fractured? And so for me, those ideas of telling stories, whether it's through the medium of filmmaking, television making, or creation, cultural expression, really leads back to a piece of where are the next stories coming from? And so that leads me to my next question. What actions do you think Canadian film and television creators can take to develop stories that represent the cultural realities of historically marginalized communities? And I know that's a very broad question, but it'd be lovely to hear sort of your perspective.
Yes, and again, I myself and our team, we think about this often, and obviously, learning and understanding more about privilege and what that looks like, and in terms of my role in creative collaboration with particular communities and understanding cultural differences. At Lark, we make really broad television, everything from reality television to crime procedurals or, legal procedurals. We kind of run the spectrum in terms of tone. And part of that is because, I believe you have to entertain people in order to inform them. And in some cases, at least the approach that Lark has taken, which is bring an audience to a story that feels familiar in how you are entertained and give them information that they may not have. In the case of, it can be even in the case of something like farming for love. We had a single farmer on the show from a South Asian family with like deep community roots, and we got to learn a little bit what it's like to be, a single woman in your 30s as the daughter of a South Asian family. And so there's a lot of learnings just in a reality dating show that you might not expect. And then obviously on the other side of that is something as broad as Alliegence, which is, essentially like a police procedural that kind of week to week through the eyes of a compassionate human in Sabrina Sohal, who is a South Asian female police officer who is looking to change the institution and realizing the obstacles that she's up against, which is an opportunity for her to show not only herself, but her community what she's up against, but also to, even in episode to episode, make slight changes in sort of how the work can be done, learn empathetically how someone who may be involved in a crime, where did they come from, how did they get there, how could we treat this differently? And I would say you take something like Law and Order, which is a franchise that people have known for decades, and I like to think that the lens that our team, which is primarily a female-led team, likes to lean into with Law and Order is like, how do we show our whole city of Toronto? Like not just particular parts of a community, but how do we show a community? How do we tell a story about, um, a community and the impacts of either police presence or, a choice that someone makes because of choices that came before them. I think that there's an empathy to storytelling that if like we said, like if it's intentional, I think there's an opportunity. I don't know that I've totally answered your question in that I guess my headline answer to that would be like, what actions can creators take? I mean, to be sort of like bigger picture, I would say find a sort of entertaining, familiar format, so to speak. And when I say format, I don't mean like a Law and Order or a farmer wants a wife.
Yeah.
I would say find like a familiar genre. I mean, look at what Jordan Peele does, in their work. Like, I think it's just like that idea of taking a genre and inserting story and history without being told you're being told story and history, but making it
Yes.
entertaining,
Yes.
finding love, finding laugh, finding suspense. I think that's such a way that I am drawn to it. It's like when I don't realize I'm learning about, historical injustice or, when I'm being told that this is how history has not been correctly told to me. I think it's like when I'm learning it about a character's experience, it feels like a more human
Yes.
understanding of another human. And we're in such a divisive time right now that if I make a show that is all about this intention of like, oh, I need to teach you about this thing, I think
Mhm.
we will turn the people that need to learn off. Whereas like a story
Yeah.
like a show like Family Law, where we had a trans character who's in her 60s who's just part of the office. It wasn't explained about transition or any of that. It was just like she was just a part of the office. Like there was no need to explain away that story and that history. It was just
Mhm.
this is the world as we see it, and we get to know through character what those experiences, lived experiences, challenges, obstacles, and opportunities are for the other characters and the audience who are watching them to come to know.
And I think, I mean, you certainly have answered my question sort of broadly and focus. And what I would like to pick up on is the idea of world building and character building and the connections that people make to their own personal lives. So I have watched Family Law, and one of the things that I appreciated about the character development of showing members from the two S LGBTQ plus communities in our diversities is really about the humanity of the individual, their family, the connection and the contributions that many of us make every day, and that it is a part of the fabric of the storytelling of a workplace.
Mm.
But then there is compassion and empathy, and the fact that when we look at how do we be, there's a lot of conversations always about how do we build inclusivity and a sense of belonging. And I think simply by including and having the type of conversations which brings our relationships together, showing the difficulties and the challenges, but also the folks that are moving through with support and with care, really is a way of mirroring what can happen in everyday day-to-day life. And certainly with the divisiveness and the pain that comes with divisiveness and the emotions, the sort of the roller coaster ride of the emotions through the storytelling that I've seen, certainly, whether it is Family Law and other stories that are being told, is that there is that link of humanity.
Mm.
Because in many ways, and so many of us and folks who are listening to this podcast episode are perhaps experiencing in their day-to-day, sort of on their micro level, individual, interpersonal relationships, a sense of isolation.
Mm.
And those stories can bring us to a place of perhaps we might feel seen, even though we're not a character, we're not highlighted in the show necessarily, but we see ourselves reflected back in. And so for me, the idea of representation is so important in this time. And for me, excellent storytelling is that way of world building that people feel a sense of connection and hope. And one of the reasons I certainly wanted to have our conversation today is about where do we find the hope, even when we're talking about tragedies,
Mm.
right? And when we're talking about how do we move from privilege and making the collaborations and building connections in community, and that we can own and create our own stories and collaborate with folks like yourself and the beautiful work that Lark Productions is doing, and the deliberate, intentional way and purposeful way that you create stories that hopefully for every Canadian that's watching will see something in that is a moment of, oh, I didn't know that, or
Mm.
that challenges themselves and finding a sense of hopefulness where they might be feeling isolated or hopeless. And particularly folks coming from sort of historically marginalized communities. So that's really, I think, a part of why this journey and these conversations are so important. Well, my last question for you, and as we move forward in our conversation, is thinking about how can the power of storytelling mobilize communities to reimagine the ways we connect and care for each other, particularly in this time.
I mean, it's a big question.
Yeah.
I like to think that just exactly as you've described, it's like that one connection. If you've made, if you've changed someone's life, like I am watching, just even on social media, everything going on around heated rivalry and the people that are sort of, coming forward in their experience in sport, as part of the queer community. And it's, um, like that's one version of it. Another version of it is like on Alliegence is like people writing into CBC to sort of say like, there was a story around birth alerts in the Indigenous community and a social worker and an Indigenous woman sort of writing in and saying, like, I saw myself in that episode. Thank you for telling, the truth about this story. So, I think there's healing in many ways in these stories. I think that there's education in many ways. I certainly like even in producing something like Alliegence, which again was very intentional, from the creator's point of view and the teams that were put together, like we're learning how to build and look at even our structures differently, and that changes things. But I think the big thing is it's like it's about, like you said, representation and everything from, a cast member who's getting their first shot as a day player in an episode, to like there was an actress in season one who, won a UBCP award for it, and or Hudson Williams, who was his first episode of television on Alliegence, or, Law and Order, to get having over 1.6 million people reading a script that, is a new writer. It's like it's exposure too, right? And um, I think like it has the opportunity to mobilize and change points of view from the people who are watching it, which I think, again, the broadest audience possible is what we're looking for, because,
Yes.
if we're too narrow in who we're targeting, I worry that the message isn't getting to the people that need to hear it. And I think when you have a show that has a reach, it means that you can impact and change people's understandings of, exactly like you said, the sort of like disrupting what the stereotypes or what people believe they think they know about a community. It can really change the narrative in a way that, like, I hope to have a positive impact, and the shows that we make would have that impact as well.
And from my perspective, the shows are having an amazing impact. And I think it's a ripple effect, right? You have the initial audience that watch the shows and connect from diverse communities. And then you have the people they talk to in their communities about the shows who might not understand what the shows are saying, but feel some kind of connection. And particularly now in our sense of world building and storytelling, where we are creating a new Canadian narrative from coast to coast to coast, we are moving in ways in real life, in real time, redefining who we are as human beings and individuals, and how, whether as we move through the pandemic and talking to neighbors or not talking to neighbors, and now all of a sudden, for those of us, myself included, who are introverts, are trying to find ways to connect with people and have conversation. But if you're in an elevator, if you're in a library or grocery store, wherever you might be going on your day, and you see what's happening with heated rivalry and all of these pieces, and the celebration, when many communities that are represented in that particular show and others are saying, from a mainstream perspective, are being told, you don't belong here, but we know we do.
Mm.
And that representation and that embrace by the prime minister, of the actor, and all of these different moments, these are moments, I think, certainly of hope and of connection, and a sense of belonging that, I'm hopeful will continue through as we mobilize stories on different platforms. And I can't even imagine what storytelling might look like in 10 years from now, which would be 2036. It's
I'm
astounding.
hopefully I'll be retired, but one last thing I would just say is, like, I just think that the whole, like, the more we bring our own curiosity and our own humility and our own desire to understand each other, I think that we have the best chance to be entertaining. Like, sometimes I find it's the frustrations and like you said, like we want to live in hope, right? And so the way to have
Yes.
hope is a way to hear and see each other. And I think that's why, like, again, like a show like Family Law does it really well, where it tackles everything from vaccinations to, you know, to, I don't know, again, vaccinations is the thing that I can think of that is like so divisive, of like, it doesn't say which
Yeah.
side of the argument you
Yeah.
need to be on. It just says, I'm here to show you both sides, and to say that,
Yeah.
like, your opinion is you can have your opinion, but my job is to also help provide the background and the information and the human experience that goes along with that. So, you know, finding a way to tell those stories authentically is, I think, a goal. And I think sometimes we get it really right, and sometimes we still are working on it. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to like empower and partner and collaborate and build a generation of storytellers that are open to that sort of curiosity and sharing a human experience that reflects all of ours.
And that is where I think will be the power of what we're talking about. The idea of multiple generations talking through, talking to each other to move us forward as a society. So, with that, I want to be mindful of your time and thank you so much for being here and joining me. And like I was saying for the audience at the beginning, I will have the details of Lark Productions and Erin's bio at the end. So thank you so much for being Until here. Next time, remember to connect, share, engage, and transform.